With a life jacket, Mike Williams, the chief electronics technician aboard the Deepwater Horizon, jumped feet first off the deck and away from the inferno. He had witnessed key events before the disaster, but if he was going to tell anyone, he would have to survive a 10-story drop into the sea.
The story will continue in a moment.
I went down way below the surface, obviously. And when I popped back up, I felt like, okay, I've made it. But I feel this god-awful burning all over me. And I'm thinking, am I on fire? You know, I just don't know. So I start doing the only thing I know to do, swim. I got to get away from this thing. I could tell I was floating in oil and grease and diesel fuel. I mean, it was just the smell. And I remember looking under the rig and seeing the water on fire. And I thought, what have you done? You were dry and you weren't covered in oil up there. Now you've jumped and you've made this and you've landed in oil. The fire's going to come across the water and you're going to burn up. And I thought, that you just got to swim harder. So I swam, and I kicked, and I swam, and I kicked, and I swam as hard as I could until I remember not feeling any more pain. And I didn't hear anything. And I thought, well, I must have burned up because I don't feel anything, I don't hear anything, I don't smell anything. I must be dead. Then I remember a real faint voice of, over here, and I thought, what in the world is that? And the next thing I know, he grabbed my life jacket and flipped me over into this small, open-bowed boat. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know where he'd come from. I didn't care. I was now out of the water.
Williams' survival may be critical to the investigation. We took his story to Dr. Bob B., a professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. Last week, the White House asked B. to help analyze the Deepwater Horizon accident. B. investigated the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster for NASA and the Hurricane Katrina disaster for the National Science Foundation. B.'s voice never completely recovered from the weeks that he spent in the flood in New Orleans, but as the White House found, he's among the nation's best. He's investigated more than 20 offshore rig disasters.
Mr. Williams comes forward with these very detailed elements from his viewpoints on the rig. That's a brave and intelligent man.
What he's saying is very important to this investigation, you believe?
It is.
What strikes Professor B. is Mike Williams' description of the blowout preventer. Williams says that in a drilling accident 4 weeks before the explosion, the critical rubber gasket called an annular was damaged, and pieces of it started coming out of the well.
According to Williams, when parts of the annular start coming up onto the deck, someone from Transocean says, look, don't worry about it. What does that tell you?
Houston, I think we have a problem.
Here's why that's so important. The annular is used to seal the well for pressure tests, and those tests determine whether dangerous gas is seeping in.
So if the annular is damaged, if I understand you correctly, you can't do the pressure tests in a reliable way.
That's correct. You may get pressure test recordings, but because you're leaking pressure, they're not reliable.
Mike Williams also told us that a backup control system to the blowout preventer called a pod had lost some of its functions.
What is the standard operating procedure if you lose one of the control pods on the BOP?
Reestablish it, fix it. It's like losing one of your legs.
The morning of the disaster, according to Williams, there was an argument in front of all of the men on the shift between the Transocean manager and the BP manager. Do you know what that argument was about?
Yes.
What was it?
Who's boss?
In finishing the well, the plan was to have a subcontractor, Halliburton, place 3 concrete plugs, like corks, in the column. The Transocean manager wanted to do this with the column full of heavy drilling fluid, what drillers call mud, to keep the pressure down below contained. But the BP manager wanted to begin to remove the mud before the last plug was set. That would reduce the pressure controlling the well before the plugs were finished.
Why would BP want to do that?
It expedites the subsequent steps.
It's a matter of going faster.
Faster, sure.
Who won the argument?
BP.
If the mud had been left in the column, would there have been a blowout?
It doesn't look like it.
To do it BP's way, they had to be absolutely certain that the first two plugs were keeping the pressure down. That life or death test was done using the blowout preventer, which had the damaged gasket. Investigators have also found that the BOP had a hydraulic leak and a weak battery.
Weeks before the disaster, they know that they are drilling into a very dangerous formation. The formation has told them that.
That's correct.
And has cost them millions of dollars.
That's correct.
And they know the BOP is broken.
Correct.
Broken in a number of ways.
Correct.
What is the appropriate thing to do at that point?
I express it to my students this way. It's stop, think, don't do something stupid.
They didn't stop. As the drilling fluid was removed, relieving the downward pressure, the plugs failed. The blowout preventer didn't work, and 11 men were incinerated. 115 crew members survived. 2 days later, the Deepwater Horizon sank to the bottom. This was just the latest disaster for a company that is the largest oil producer in the United States. BP, once known as British Petroleum, was found willfully negligent in a 2005 Texas refinery explosion that killed 15 of its workers. BP was hit with $108 million in fines, the highest workplace safety fines in U.S. history. Now, we have found there is new concern about another BP facility in the Gulf. A former BP insider tells us this platform, called Atlantis, is a greater threat than the Deepwater Horizon. Ken Abbott has worked for Shell and GE, and in 2008 he was hired by BP to manage thousands of engineering drawings for the Atlantis platform.
They serve as blueprints and also as a operator manual, if you will, on how to make this thing work and, more importantly, how to shut it down in an emergency.
But Abbott says that he found that 89% of those critical drawings had not been inspected and approved by BP engineers. Even worse, he says 95% of the underwater welding plans had never been approved either.
Are these welding procedures supposed to be approved in the paperwork before the welds are done?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So they're
critical.
Critical.
Abbott's charges are backed up by BP internal emails. In 2008, BP manager Barry Duff wrote that the lack of approved drawings could result in catastrophic operator errors. And currently there are hundreds, if not thousands, of subsea documents that have never been finalized. Duff called the practice fundamentally wrong.
I've never seen this kind of attitude where, safety doesn't seem to matter, and when you complain of a problem like Barry did and like I did and try to fix it, you're just criticized and pushed aside.
Ken Abbott was laid off. He took his concerns to a consumer advocacy group called Food and Water Watch. They're asking Congress to investigate, and he is filing suit in an attempt to force the federal government to shut down Atlantis.
The Atlantis is still pumping away out there, 200,000 barrels a day, and it'll be 4 times that in a year or two when they put in all 16 wells. I mean, if something happens there, it'll make the Deepwater Horizon look like a bubble in the water by comparison.
In an email, BP told us the Atlantis crew had all the documents it needs to run the platform safely. We also wanted BP's perspective on the Deepwater Horizon disaster. The company scheduled an interview with its CEO, Tony Hayward, and then they canceled, saying no one at BP could sit down with 60 Minutes for this report. In other interviews, Hayward has said this about Transocean, the owner of the Deepwater Horizon.
The responsibility for safety on the drilling rig is with Transocean. It is their rig. their equipment, their people, their systems, their safety processes.
When BP's Chief Executive Officer, Tony Hayward, says that this is Transocean's accident, what do you say?
I get sick. This kind of division in the industry is a killer. The industry is comprised of many organizations, and they all share the responsibility for successful operations. And to start placing, we'll call it these barriers, and pointing fingers at each other is totally destructive.
But who's responsible?
BP.
We went out on the Gulf and found mats of thick floating oil. No one has a fix on how much oil is shooting out of the well, but some of the best estimates suggest it's the equivalent of the Exxon Valdez spill every 4 to 7 days. Scientists are now reporting vast plumes of oil up to 10 miles long under the surface. The spill has cost BP about $500 million so far, but consider, in just the first 3 months of this year, BP made profits of $6 billion. There are plenty of accusations to go around that BP pressed for speed, Halliburton's cement plugs failed, and Transocean damaged the blowout preventer. Through all the red flags, they pressed ahead. It was, after all, the Deepwater Horizon, the world record holder, celebrated as among the safest in the fleet.
Men lost their lives. I don't know how else to say it. All the things that they told us could never happen, happened.